We start our evidence session today. I want to welcome our witnesses. Before we start, can I just ask Naz Shah to just declare interests?
Just to say, I'm the co-chair of the Islamophobia APPG, and I work with Miqdad for the Labour Party and work that we're doing. I regularly work with TellMama as well through my work with the APPG.
Thank you very much. Can I welcome witnesses? Just ask you very briefly to just introduce yourselves and which organisations you are from.
Okay, my name is Bharat Ganesh. I'm a senior researcher at TellMama. I'm focused mainly on recording data on anti-Muslim incidents and responsible for writing the reports that we've put out.
Fayez Miguel, founder of TellMama and previously the director from 2012 to 2016.
Miqdad Versi, Assistant Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain. A lot of my work is related to Islamophobia, and I wrote the written submission to the HomeAffairsCommittee.
Great. Thank you very much. Can I just ask each of you to just tell us, to start off with, how much of an increase you think there has been in Islamophobia, and how much you think that is reporting, how much you think there is different things that are causing an actual rise, and what causes you would identify. Mr. Versi.
Thank you very much. I think for me, the statistics obviously TellMama will be able to give in much better detail than I can. What I can bring hopefully to the conversation is that from a media monitoring perspective, the kind of hatred that seems to be coming out within the media is highly problematic and does seem to have been on the rise in the last few years. Even in the last week, we've seen some really quite atrocious headlines. So that's one part of the story that I think is very clear and is perhaps correlated to the broader increase in Islamophobia in the wider public. In terms of my friends, in terms of my the reports that I receive as a relatively well-known Muslim community individual, I've seen far more people within my community, within friends that I know, who have experienced this. I know now, I think about 10 or 15 people who I personally know who have dealt or have had to deal with Islamophobia in terms of hate crime, verbal assault, and even a physical assault. And if that's happening to me, that's happening to many people across the country.
Okay, Mr. Mughal.
I mean, we would concur with what Miqdad has been saying around the press, but let me just go back to your initial question. Has there been an increase in reporting for the Muslim community? The answer is possibly. We don't know. The second part to that question is there a correlation between national and international incidences and very sharp spikes in anti-Muslim hatred? The answer is yes. There are very clear correlations in data that comes to us directly from victims within Muslim communities that shows very clear, very large spikes in reporting and recording around major national and international incidences. Let me go back to that. These spikes are gaining in amplitude. They're not getting less. So each spike we are finding correspondingly gets higher and higher and higher, and the background noise, the amplitude, the background noise is getting wider and wider. So there is an issue here. It's an ongoing issue, and it's a widening issue.
I would add to Fayez a few things on top. One of the things that it's incredibly difficult to identify what is causing the increase in our numbers. I think that if we break it down qualitatively, there's quite a few reasons why we might suggest that there's actually an increase in the level of Islamophobia. If we look at the activity of the far right, for example, online, there's been a huge spike in activity, particularly in 2016, and I'm sure we'll have time to get into that a little bit later. In particular, it's been the kind of rhetoric that's been used during elections and campaigns. And this is also a transnational network. It's important to remember that it has a sort of global reach. So that's one part of it. The other thing is that the majority of the incidents that were reported to TellMama back in 2012, 2013, and even 2014 were online incidents. So those were things that were happening on social media platforms. Now a much larger proportion and the majority of our incidents are coming in as offline incidents. Now most of our most of our outreach happens on social media. So we would expect a high level of online reports. So the fact that we're getting so many offline reports, yes, does speak to the fact that more people know about TellMama. But I think it also does give us a good indication that because of the large increase in offline attacks that we've been seeing, it's a likelihood that the level of Islamophobia is also increasing in general.
And is your sense that you are seeing an increase in the number of perpetrators, or that those who are being Islamophobic are becoming more vocal or more active?
I think we're seeing a mix of the two. We It's hard to count how many perpetrators because we've changed some of our data collection procedures to better record the number of perpetrators that we've had. So I can't comment on whether or not there's been an increase since 2012 or 2013, for example. However, I can say that the number of people that are kind of exposed to Islamophobic and anti-Muslim rhetoric is definitely increased. And when we look kind of at the incidents qualitatively, what's said to people, that kind of thing, it's quite frequently referencing the sort of things you hear in the media. So for example, after Brexit, there were numerous incidents where a Muslim was told, we're out of the EU now, what are you still doing here? Things of those types of nature. And that's quite an odd thing, right? Because the EU referendum was a referendum on membership in a political union, not a referendum on migrants or people of other religions in the UK.
There's also, if I may add, there's also a very strong strain of misogyny that is wrapped up in the anti-Muslim hatred. We need to be very clear about this. Majority of the perpetrators are male, predominantly male, and the age range in our 2015 report has gone from 15 to 35 to 13 to 18-year-olds. So something is creating a generational shift in the kind of perpetrator base we are seeing. But let me go back to the issue of what the intersectionality which is impacting on individuals. The majority of the victims are female. So what we have in a large number of cases is misogyny, misogynistic language, sexualized language mixed in with anti-Muslim hatred to humiliate the woman, predominantly women who are the focus of this hatred.
And when you talked about the shift to 13 to 18-year-olds, is that a shift away from, you seeing less than the 15 to 30-year-olds, or is it just that as part of the increase, it's the 13 to 18-year-olds where it's increased?
We're seeing a slight clustering in that 13 to 18-year-old area in the age range. So whether it's because social media is effectively bleeding into a younger generation, more work needs to be done. We're not sure, but certainly there's a clustering in a younger population. And that is a significant shift from 3 years ago when our age range was pretty much in between 15 to 35.
And when you're thinking about the 13 to 18-year-olds, does that tend to be targeted at other young people? Is this part of what's happening in terms of in schools, or is it just aimed more widely?
Well, we know that 1 in 10 incidences that came into TellMama in 2015 involved incidences at school. 1 in 10. That's a significant number. Is it targeted towards perpetrators who are younger? Well, no. Actually, the age range is quite disparate. It's quite wide. So these are young individuals, sometimes openly abusing women who may be 25, 30, 35. So actually, there is a sense in those young people that they can clearly vocalize what they've come across or what they're thinking.
And do you have any suggested explanations as to what is driving that?
Well, we think
among the young people particularly.
Much more research needs to be done on this area, but certainly social media is not helping.
I think we've seen an immense increase and immense amount of confidence from the far right and the self-fashioned alt-right, as we've seen in the United States. Those narratives are definitely penetrating into younger age groups than we would expect. Typically, these sorts of perpetrators, we've thought that they were older, in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, but now actually it appears that there's quite a few young people that are being exposed to these narratives and this kind of rhetoric.
And some of those outright or far-right things that you talked about, is that UK-based or international or US-based?
Well, it's kind of a big mix. So one of the things that we've seen are young people on Twitter that are UK-based, that are getting their information from sources in the United States who are kind of far-right, people in France, Germany, Netherlands, other parts of Europe as well that are also far-right, as well as some of the ideologues that we have in the UK as well. There's a large transnational echo chamber forming, and it's been in place for some time. And it appears that younger people are being more and more influenced by that rhetoric.
Okay, Nasha.
So, thank you very much, Chair. Just want to ask a couple of questions, really. Yesterday, a man shouted, "I want to kill a Muslim," before threatening a Muslim woman and actually going on to stabbing a Muslim man. Where is this coming from? Just an open question, really. Where do you feel? Where is this?
I think I mentioned this before, but I feel like I need to mention it again. The research from the University of Cambridge concluded that mainstream media reporting about Muslim communities is contributing to an atmosphere of rising hostility towards Muslims in Britain. A round table in Stockholm, which was trying to look at this across Europe, came to similar conclusions. That the biggest driver for anti-Muslim hatred within the wider population, of which there is a lot, is the media. And look, we've got figures to that, whether it's the 37% of the British population who would support policies to reduce the number of Muslims in the UK, whether it's 50% who think that Islam is a threat to Western civilization, whether it's 30% of young children between 10 and 14 who think there are too many Muslims in the UK. Whichever poll you want to choose, all of them corroborate one another, which says that there is a real view of Muslims in wider society which is not positive, at least within a significant proportion of the population. And where is this coming from? Well, the academics seem to think, or at least some of the academics seem to think, that media is one of the biggest drivers. And in the last couple of weeks, I've seen about 10 different headlines which have been wholly Islamophobic, whether it is new £5 notes will be banned by religious groups as the bank can't prove they're halal. I mean, what? Seriously? And this is what's happening and going on. I mean, there are 10 examples of this. 4 in 10 British Muslims want Sharia law enforced in the UK. The Muslim suburbs where wife beating and marital rape are standard. This is the son, Trevor Kavanagh, who's a member of the media regulator on this, and that's what he said. Isolated Muslims see the UK as 70% Islamic. It is really problematic that there are these headlines that are saying these things that are so dangerous. I mean, this weekend we had an article in The Sun which was talking about OAPs, and then had a picture, and it said, "Cut out and keep guide. Here's what terrorists look like." Here's what terrorists look like. I have a picture of two white men, a man and a woman, big picture, and saying they're OAPs, they're nice guys. But here's what terrorists look like. And they had a picture of Osama bin Laden with a big beard. They had a picture with a woman with a headscarf, and had a picture of another Muslim. 3 Muslims out there. This is what they look like. And that happened just a couple of days ago. This is the reality that we face, and I feel that this is something that needs to be looked at very, very closely. And there are processes in place. There are answers to this. Lord Leveson did have an inquiry. There were specific things that were put in place. We have Section 40 of the Crime and Courts Act 2013, which can be implemented as a policy by the government if it chooses to do so. That there are policies in place that can start trying to change this. But that has not happened. And I wanted to bring that forward because I think it's a very important point.
Can I just add to what Miqdad has said, and I again just want to add something quite important. Miqdad mentioned the issue of the Sun, saying this is what a terrorist looks like. We had a lot of complaints from Sikh organisations and groups who also said, frankly, that also targets us in the way that Osama bin Laden potentially looks. Nobody can tell a difference between a Sikh and a Muslim, so it also impacts on us. So these are wider community cohesion issues that are happening, much wider than we think. I want to also add, if I can, and Miqdad is really the guy who deals with the press on this and his specialism, but I want to add on and bolt on another area around social media. And I know that this committee and other committees have looked at this time and time again, but I'm going to go back to it because it is a significant and ongoing problem, and it affects many parts of our country and our communities. The fact that Facebook has been very, very responsive and I think responsible, but the fact that Twitter continues to be in a position where it is obstinate, obfuscatory, and sometimes it doesn't action what is clearly, or what are clearly far-right networks, is a problem. Just to give you an example, we've been engaging with Twitter for the last 2.5 weeks on clear extremist far-right networks. Clear, we've had to do the police's work and actually put the networks together, explain what the networks are, give names, identities that are open source to Twitter to say, here is the evidence, and we've reported through their channels. Those accounts are still open. 14 days later, one account has tweeted out over 2,500 times, in those 14 days. This is what we are dealing with. We're dealing with global corporations who think that actually they can carry on as business as normal when the state, our police forces, our communities, and this state that we live in has to pick up the bill. This cannot be picked up anymore. The number of police officers that are running around because of some guy in San Francisco wanting to create a platform to make money from is not acceptable. And I think we need to say it, and we need to be firm, and we need to haul them in and say, why are you not acting? And it's not just us. The Jewish community has been systematically affected. The LGBT and gay communities have been systematically affected. Women are systematically affected. Kathy Newman yesterday, Channel 4 presenter, the appalling abuse she gets. And this cannot carry on.
And can I ask you, that example that you just raised, that is a network based here in the UK, and that is still live at the moment. And what response have Twitter given you? What's the current response that they've given you?
Nothing.
So you had no response from them at all?
We've had an email, a couple of emails saying send us more and more information. We have. Those individuals there is a criminal ongoing case with one individual, and all that evidence has been given. I mean, we've mapped it out for them. And we have had no response. That's 14 days after mapping out everything and going through the whole process with them. By the way, we've spent 4 years on one account reporting that account in 4 years. It has gone to Police Scotland. They've done nothing. Twitter have done nothing. That individual has now become the focal point for extremist far-right activity, the focal point in the United Kingdom.
And when you talk about a network, can you describe what you mean with the network?
We mean individuals who will open up websites, who will name and shame members of the Muslim community, who will give addresses of where they're going to speak, who will put them at risk in terms of their social activities. These are individuals who regard Muslims as groomers and paedophiles and should be deported, if not deported, eradicated from this country. This is the language we are dealing with. And there is a real risk after the murder of Joe Cox. There is a real risk to individuals in our country that organisations and corporations like Twitter simply disregard when it comes to these issues, and it cannot continue anymore.
If I could briefly add, in this particular instance, there was an account that was taken down by Twitter, and another user on Twitter had said, "Oh, follow my friend, they've got a new account." And within a few days, that person had almost a few thousand followers. So in terms of the network, they all know each other, they work with each other, and they work together to get their message out. So we see kind of a tight cooperation between different members of this network.
Following on from that, we know we've heard lots of evidence in the previous session around hate crimes, but what is it that, in your opinion, is missing from the political response? What's missing? What do we need to do to get this right?
Well, you've heard my position on social media,
yeah.
And I think we need to be robust on that. I think we also need to be particularly robust on and have much more of a robust approach around politicians who use scenarios, and I'm going to go back to this, and poster campaigns showing individuals who may be of a different race, wearing headscarves, and these have been used in the run-up to campaigns. Those have serious impacts on our communities, and I think we need to be politically robust to say, if there is a responsibility to ensure safety and security in our country, then we need to actually tackle, challenge, and stand up to people who are promoting such rhetoric. I think that's the second thing. The third thing, I think, which is really, I think, quite important, is we also need to be an environment where our police forces are given the ability to do their job in the online world. I meet police officers who are dedicated and committed every day of our working lives. The fact that they don't have adequate training in what happens in the online world, the ability to have that ongoing support as to how they deal with online cases is a barrier in their work. And it's not because of the good leadership we find in police services and police forces. It's because resourcing is actually a major issue for these officers at a front line dealing with the online world. And I would sincerely ask, that we ask corporations like Twitter, who give not a single cent to our country, not a single pound they take from our country, but they don't give a single cent, to reinvest some of their profits into our police services, to provide that training to frontline officers who are managing the fallout from their platform. That's what I would ask.
Thank you, Chair.
Sorry.
when it comes to the actual things we need to get done, I think I've talked about media and the institution of Section 40 of the Crime and Courts Act. I think that's one area which can help on the IDF media. I concur with Fayaz on social media. I think that's a really important part of the overall message. But we have to also recognize that we need political leadership. When there are issues which are completely and utterly unacceptable, done by individuals of the political elite, they have to be called out for doing so. Whether it is in the run-up to the mayoral campaign, whether it is during the time of Brexit, any of these times we cannot have a situation where this type of rhetoric is able to be passed and big posters can happen and change the actual fabric of what many people think is acceptable. This is the biggest challenge, I think, is that we have a social acceptability of Islamophobia within broader society now, which I think is the biggest danger. Baron Swarty talked about passing the dinner table test several years ago. I think that's gone even further now. It is now mainstream within newspapers to attack Muslims for a range of different issues. It's mainstream within some areas, some politicians to talk about Muslims in a very negative way. We need to change that. And that is a big part of what we need to do to go forward. And the final area is education. Our young children, as Fiaz was saying, there are more perpetrators amongst young children. We have polls which show that the views amongst young children of Muslims is more and more negative than it used to be in the past. This is worrying. If 30% of our young children think that there are too many Muslims in the UK, what's this going to mean for our future? We need to have much better, and I think some of the work of the government strategy on this is dealing with this, and I think it's very good that it is doing so. We need more on that area so that our young children can be very much part of our ongoing society.
Okay, Ms. Raghani.
Thank you, Chair. This week, yesterday, the Prime Minister announced adopting a definition of anti-Semitism, along with 56 other countries at the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. There doesn't seem to be a universal understanding of what Islamophobia is, or can you tell me otherwise, Mr. Nugul?
The answer to that is no, there is no universal definition of what Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hatred is. You're absolutely right. Could I just add a few caveats to that? And I'll add the caveats. The adoption yesterday of the definition around anti-Semitism, we would warmly accept within TellMama. We would warmly accept that because we have seen the damage that anti-Semitism in the last 5 years has created within Jewish communities, because we work very closely with Jewish communities and we are very honoured to be in that position, and we have some strong partnerships. And so when we have members of the Jewish community who are held to account for the state of Israel, that is anti-Semitism. When we have members of the Muslim community who are asked to hold and be held to account for Iraq and Syria, that is anti-Muslim bigotry. And there are some very clear similarities, but clearly some differences in where both communities have come from. So we warmly accept the Prime Minister's step. We value the incredible work she's been doing on hate crime. We stand with Jewish communities in the definition of anti-Semitism. And I was looking at the definition yesterday, and actually if you take out anti-Semitism and put in anti-Muslim, that definition stands absolutely around Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred. And I'll finish off by saying that what the Prime Minister has done through the work of Eric Pickles, so Eric Pickles has been pushing this, and through the work of Jewish communities in Europe who've been absolutely steadfast in working towards this, is they've opened up the door for solid definitions around anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia in the future. And we must welcome those, appreciate that, and also congratulate Jewish communities and Sir Eric Pickles and the Prime Minister for taking this stance.
So just to clarify, there is no preferred definition of Islamophobia, but you are arguing that if we took out the term anti-Semitism of the statement that was agreed by 56 countries and put in Islamophobia, you think that could work and that would be adopted by many countries?
It would absolutely stand firm, and it could easily be adopted across, and it is an opening trailblazer for other communities to follow.
Okay. And when we talk, if I can just take you back to the Macpherson report that looked at institutional racism, do you think there is an opportunity or capacity to try and identify, research and calculate if there is institutional Islamophobia in this country?
The answer to that is absolutely. We have quite a number of cases of individuals who come to us talking about institutional Islamophobia. Let me explain what that would be. And that basically is that people who have been sacked from work because they have tried to pray or they have wanted to pray, it's not affected their work, people who have not got promotions, people who have got poor services in goods and services, we've had individuals who have approached us to say, look, this is unacceptable. So there is that issue.
Well, Mr. Mughal, we recently produced a report on anti-Semitism and looked at institutional anti-Semitism. And for it to be institutional, we didn't look at one-off incidences. It was a thread of incidences. So when people are coming forward and giving evidence to you, within an organisation, within an institution, are they numerous examples or just one?
There are numerous examples. They usually will. In the vast majority of the cases, there will be numerous incidences impacting on the one individual that will be happening over a period of time. And so it is not just a one-off. This continues in their line of work and in their duty of work.
And if I can just turn to Mr. Versi, I'm going to ask a slightly nuanced question. I hope the committee will go with me on this. We talked about Islamophobia. I want to talk about Islamophobia within Muslim communities. And no doubt you saw Muslims Like Us, which was on the BBC recently. Does the Muslim Council of Britain represent every Muslim that's on that TV programme?
The Muslim Council of Britain, what we do is we are an umbrella body. We represent our affiliates. That's what we can do. That's what we can claim a mandate on, because those affiliates pay membership and they are therefore our affiliates. So we can say that of the 500 plus affiliates of mosques, charities, schools across the country who choose to affiliate with the Muslim Council of Britain, we can represent them. Do we say that that is a representative of the broader society as a whole? Well, we think it's relatively reflective, but it cannot be considered to be entirely reflective of the entire society. That would not be fair to
When you
try and
submitted
pretend.
evidence to the committee, and quite often when you quote to the media, you claim to represent the Muslim community in Britain. So do you represent...
Can I just ask, where did you say that we claim to represent the entire Muslim community?
Whenever, I can give you examples.
Although,
Just
yeah,
a moment.
please.
Do you represent one of the characters on Muslims Like Us, Ferran, who is the gay Muslim?
I think that there are gay Muslims in many communities across the UK. The way that we work is we're an affiliate-based body. We represent our affiliates, and as much as any of the individuals, gay Muslims or otherwise, are part of those affiliates, that's who we can claim to represent, and those are the people who elect those leaderships, and those leaderships elect us. I can't say for any, what we want to claim a mandate for is who we represent, those who elect us. That's how I think most organisations will work, and that's what we can claim a mandate on. The last time a question was asked, a simple question rather than some sort of compound different question, a simple question was asked, is the Muslim Council of Britain representative of your views? The last time that was asked, a majority of Muslims said yes.
Majority of Muslims?
A majority. This is the BBC Commerce poll last year, January. There are, I'm sure that, if you look at individual examples where they try and change the question and they try and twist things, that's different. But when it comes to a simple question, do you represent your views? The answer is yes.
There are 500, you say you represent 500 mosques. Are any of those Ahmadi or Ismaili mosques?
I do not believe any of them. None of them are Ahmadi. I do not believe any of them are Ismaili.
So you don't represent Ahmadis, you don't represent Ismailis. You're not sure if you represent Muslims who are gay, but you claim to represent the majority of Muslims in this country.
I don't want to make a claim that I can't support, and I won't do so. What I'll say is that we have affiliates. They vote for us. We represent those views, those 500 plus views. That's what 500 plus affiliates' views. The latest poll suggests that a majority of Muslims think that we represent their views. Can we say that?
Which Muslims, of which? Just Sunni Muslims, I assume.
Well, this was a poll done of British Muslims. So we can ask BBC Comrades.
Just one final question. I just want to, when we talked about rises, especially within school, of incidences of Islamophobic activity, is there a rise of Islamophobia across or between Muslims who are of different faiths? Mr. Mughal.
The answer to that is absolutely there is. There are peaks of intra-Muslim bigotry that we have recorded against the Ahmadiyya community. After the murder of Asad Shah, even though the murder was not linked to him being Ahmadiyya, we picked up a peak of those attacks. Just yesterday in Pakistan has also caused an impact on the community here. But let me be very clear. There is intra-Shia bigotry, there is intra-Ahmadiyya bigotry, and there is bigotry against LGBT Muslims because they report it to us in TellMama. And the fact is, if we are talking about tackling hate, intolerance and prejudice, if we do not tackle the intolerance within and beyond communities, then it gives the far right and other extremist groups the absolute hook they want to attack Muslim communities. We cannot be impartial in standing against hatred. If we find it against gay Muslims, we will stand with the community wherever they are, and we must take that approach right the way throughout. It's a human rights approach.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
David Winnick.
The Chair will be pleased that my questions will probably be fewer than my colleague, but be that as it may. Without wishing to be complacent, any form of prejudice is undesirable, let alone hatred. And what was said about social media is, of course, very relevant, bearing in mind the inquiry we had into anti-Semitism. But would it not be right to say that the large majority, perhaps going further, the overwhelming majority of Muslims in this country go about their business like the rest of the residents of this country, without hindrance, without difficulties, while recognising the very valid points you make? Would that be a fair assessment, that the large majority of Muslims are able to go about their lawful business like anyone else?
I think that's probably fair. I think most Muslims probably are able to continue their normal lives. I think, though, there is a fear within a larger proportion of Muslims, because most Muslims probably know somebody who suffered from either verbal abuse or otherwise. So if you know someone who has suffered from verbal abuse or social media abuse or physical abuse when it comes to Islamophobia, then that's obviously going to be something that affects you. People I know individuals who are very much, a member, a journalist who works at the BBC, someone who's a pharmacist. These are real people who are part of society, who are working day in, day out, and they're worried about going onto the train. I mean, there is a real worry amongst many communities. So whilst the majority, I agree, it doesn't affect them in that way, I think the fear, though, is much more prevalent.
I'd also like to add to Mikdad's point. What we've seen from mapping out incidents from TellMama data as well as from the Metropolitan Police is that a significant amount of incidents happen in the places where people frequent every day. So we're talking about main arterial roads between places where people are commuting from home to work. We see 20% of all of our incidents happened on the transport network in 2015. So that's buses, coaches, trains, as well as bus stops and rail platforms. So what we've seen is that anti-Muslim hate crime tends to happen between the places where people go every day. We've had a huge number of incidents that happened at places of business while people were shopping, right? So it may not be the case that Muslims are not able to go about their daily business, but where they are targeted and where they are experiencing incidents are those everyday circuits.
Now, I think it was you, Mr. Percy, who made the point about politicians who can exploit the situation. I mean, would there be any affinity in that, whereas now it's totally unacceptable, except from the extreme right, the Nazi right, if you like, to have a go at Jews. There's no votes for it as far as the mainstream political parties are concerned. But when it comes to Muslims, that's not quite the attitude taken by some mainstream politicians. In some respects, I'm asking you, is it a sort of modern anti-Semitism?
So what do you mean by a model of
Politicians who use, at various stages, anti-Muslim prejudice.
Yeah.
Would you describe that as a sort of modern day, in Britain at least, anti-Semitism?
I don't want to make comparisons. Like, we can talk about the Catholics in the UK, where we can talk about the black communities in the 80s. We can talk about anti-Semitism earlier. There are definitely lessons to be drawn from our history. That's very important that we do learn from that. Even when it comes to media organisations and the way that gay people are represented within the media, or transphobia within the media in the last couple of years. I've talked to managing editors who've told me that there's been a material change in the last couple of years because things have moved on. I fully agree that this is something that can change, as it has done in other communities and other groups that we've identified earlier.
I wonder if I can give you a quote. It arises from the elections that took place for London Mayor. Now, a former Conservative minister, Lady Wolsey, accused opponents, after all, party-wise, she was an opponent, but she said supporters of the opponents of Sadiq Khan engage in unambiguous bigotry, far exceeding the bounds of electioneering. Do you think there's justification in that, the accusation made by the former Conservative minister? But opponents of Sadiq Khan.
Well, yeah. Look, I think some of the campaigning that took place was uncalled for. I think some of the campaigning stressed a link towards standing on platforms with extremists and terrorists. I think some of the literature we saw coming into us from far-right groups who were using Sadiq's picture and circulating it certainly have overtones of, I would say, anti-Muslim bigotry. Do I think another candidate who was not Muslim would be subjected to that? The answer, I would say, in my view, is no. And whilst the press, I just want to add, whilst the press have every right to look at who shares a platform with which organisation and which individual, the amount of press coverage that Sadiq got was actually way over and above, frankly, any other individual would have got in those scenarios. So I think there is an element of that.
And consistency is very important here. You don't have the exact same approach, the exact same questions led to those of other faiths and other politicians. And that's why it is very, very important that we have political leadership and agreement by all that this is not acceptable. We cannot have the social acceptability and even the political acceptability of Islamophobia mainstreamed in society.
There was a leaflet distributed, it appeared, to Hindus and Sikhs, warning that their jewellery may be at risk. I don't know what Sadiq Khan would do with the jewellery, flog it perhaps. That was outright racist, wasn't it?
Well, I'm not sure about the context of that, but certainly if anyone's jewellery is at risk, it is from individuals who will be criminals, and I don't see Sadiq Khan being in any way, shape or form that kind of an individual. But let me just say this, that campaigning must never happen again within our very liberal, open, diverse capital. And I think the voters made very clear their response to a campaign like that. It is not who we are, it is not what we stand for. And actually, one of the greatest selling points of Britain, Great Britain, is the fact that we are able to absorb and live with and coexist and get on with our lives. That is the greatest asset we have.
But what's very important here is that we didn't have cross-party senior people talking about how bad this campaign was and how it won't happen again. There were individuals who did so, but that wasn't an institutional response. We need to ensure that institutionally this does not happen again.
Final question, the Chair will be pleased to know. I said I wouldn't ask as many questions as my colleague on the right. They were very interesting questions, I'm not criticising. Do you feel that the election of President Trump, with his anti-Muslim rhetoric, banning, so he's claimed he would do, hopefully he won't, banning Muslims from the United States and the rest of it, do you think that it's possible it could have an unfortunate impact in Britain, leaving aside the extremists and the outright racists? Do you think it could be that negative in Britain?
I would say that it's not only possible, that there's causal evidence that this is the case.
Like what?
If we look again at, for example, in our 2015 report, we had about 200 perpetrators that were reported to us on Twitter. Some of them were responsible for crimes and some of them were responsible for hate incidents. I think over 60 of them mutually followed Donald Trump. So Donald Trump's rhetoric was inspiring and giving confidence to far-right narratives and those who committed hate crimes on Twitter that were reported to TellMama. So his rhetoric was directly linked to Twitter users in the United Kingdom that were engaging in this kind of behavior.
And even more than that, we have seen examples where the rhetoric of Donald Trump has then therefore been used directly within far-right circles in the UK, whether it is Muslims do not report terrorism, these kinds of nonsense, unjustifiable accusations that are made by the most senior members of the American government or future members of the American government. That kind of thing is very worrying, especially when that rhetoric is then the basis of many far-right groups here. We literally copy and paste the work that or the reporting of those comments. And it's not just what Donald Trump has said, but many of the people who now surround him, who have previously said outrageous things about Muslims, they are also spreading. And their statements now, when it comes out in The Sun, in the Daily Mail, guess what? They're only reporting statements that were made elsewhere. That's the problem. They're just going to be reporting this stuff so they can spread this. It becomes more socially acceptable.
Thank you.
I would want to add a few things. One of the things that we've seen, for example, Steve Bannon, who Donald Trump is surrounding himself with, editor of Breitbart News, or owner, he's invited numerous times Pamela Geller, who's a known anti-Muslim extremist, onto his platform and put out her blog posts, interviewed her frequently, and those are things that are being posted, again, by members of the far right in Britain. For example, a website that we know of called Fahrenheit 211. They're posting, again, stuff that Pamela Geller is saying. So the linkage between the far right in the United States and the far right in Britain is extremely strong, and I would say that they're actually quite responsible for many of the ways in which anti-Muslim rhetoric has developed recently.
And in fact, the Breitbart site just yesterday posted a whole text from Pamela Geller, who was banned by the Home Secretary. So this is what we're talking about, reposting, cross-information transfer.
Okay. Thank you. Ronald J. Wardner.
Thank you, Chairman. Can we just step back from the links that are being suggested and look at some of the polling that is driven by conversations and therefore evidence with people in this country? A 2015 YouGov poll found that 55% of voters in Britain thought that there was a fundamental clash between Islam and the values of British society. So this is not my views. These are the views of the British voters, 55% of them. Do you think that such views constitute Islamophobia?
I think there's a difference in whether or not those views constitute Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hatred. I think those views are representative of the broadening anxiety towards Muslims that's been distributed by the different things that we've talked about today. So in that sense, yes, there's a broadening anxiety towards Muslims. Does that qualify as anti-Muslim hatred? Of course not.
So you would not say that actually suggesting that there is a clash between Islam and the values of British society, you would not say that that is Islamophobic?
I mean, again, it goes into the debates that people have had about what does Islamophobia mean. And so that's why I've been trying to qualify it as a broader anxiety towards Muslims, of frustration or problematization of Muslims. Absolutely, that's what that represents.
Yeah, so the Runnymede Trust is the definition that many people go by right now, and that was in 1991. It talked about Islamophobia being defined as the unfounded hostility towards Muslims and therefore fear or dislike of all or most Muslims. I think the reality is something like that might contribute towards a broadening view of Muslims in a negative context and therefore likely to stoke Islamophobia. But we have to be careful about saying that, of course, you can have a critical view of Islam. Of course, you can think that, I disagree with Islam. I think it's fundamentally wrong. I think it's against the values I stand for. People can have those views. What is very dangerous is if that is stoking views of hatred of actual Muslims on the ground, and if that the idea of just saying, I hate Islam, is actually just them putting out their hatred of individual Muslims, but using that as a means to cover it. That's the problem.
Well, that's helpful, and perhaps I can refer to some other evidence from polling which says that the more religious character and general social conservatism of British Muslim communities does not detract from the essentially secular character of most Muslim lifestyles. And in terms of their everyday concerns and priorities, British Muslims answer no differently from their non-Muslim neighbours. So I think, though perhaps some polls show that there might be a clash, others would suggest that there is much less of such a clash. But you said earlier that, Mr. Versi, that there were suggestions that Muslims didn't report terrorism and that was unfounded. But would you agree that the Muslim community in Britain perhaps doesn't help its own cause by saying, in a question, how prominent do you think extremist views within Muslim communities are? Over a quarter chose the option, extremist views do not exist. Do you not think that actually undermines what you said?
I think the reality is people on the ground, individuals, if they don't know anyone who's an extremist, do they
not watch the news?
Well, that's the point. Some people, understandably, perhaps, think that sometimes the media might overblow things. I don't think it is acceptable. I want to make it very, very clear. There is extremism. It exists. It's unacceptable. We need to fight together as a society to tackle it. I don't want to pretend for any moment that's not the case. I'm trying to explain that we have to be very careful about how we read polls. I mean, every academic, and I'm sure that I think there are academics who are late who will come and they'll be able to say that if you look at an individual poll by itself, we have to be careful. For example,
this is why
one
I'm
poll.
comparing two polls,
Exactly. So, for example,
to provide you that context.
Exactly. So, for example, there was one poll which was done earlier this year which said that Muslims are more sympathetic to terrorism than the wider society. The latest poll said the exact opposite. The Muslims are actually less sympathetic to terrorists than the wider society.
So perhaps I can just put another statistic at you.
Yeah, I know those polls well. So
31% thought that the US government was behind the September 11th attacks.
That's huge.
How can that be defended?
I know, it can't be defended. And it's really worrying that in the States, I think the New York Times said that in America, I think half the population think that the US was hiding something about 9/11. Half the population in America, according to the New York Times, believe that the US government were hiding something about 9/11. So these conspiracy theories are unfortunately very prevalent. In the UK, when it comes to conspiracy theories, I think 35% of the broader population, according to that poll that you're citing, believed in conspiracy theories. Now, I agree, there's problems here, and we need to tackle it, but we have to recognise that this is not a Muslim-specific problem. These are challenges that we face as a society.
Well, the 9/11 statistic is very specifically...
To the UK, yes. I'm saying compared to the US. Yeah.
I think you raise issues here which show the complexity of what we are dealing with in a wide variety of areas. Given that we work within Muslim communities and given that our work is around anti-Muslim hatred, we have also come in for attacks from small sections of Muslim communities for being, quote, too Jew-friendly, for being the friends of Zionists, because our chair is Jewish, for being in the pay of Mossad. These are just the daily regurgitations we come across from groups who purport to be tackling Islamophobia. Let me tell you, those groups also have some sway in this House. And it is extremely troubling. It is extremely troubling in our society to come across mindsets that live in our country that promote this absolute nonsense, that corrode communities, and who give that absolute view to extremists beyond the Muslim community that all Muslims are like that. And I make no bones about this. We have to tackle that group head on as well and make very clear that their conspiracy, their anti-Semitism, their hatred towards other communities, and that their unipolar view of life actually will be challenged. And I am going to say this. The Home Office needs to have a spine. And the Home Office needs to have a spine in challenging these groups, because the number of times I've gone to the Home Office and said to civil servants, have a spine and give us the ability to challenge, and they have run away.
Can we have some examples?
Well, yes, I'll give you examples. I've asked for projects to be enacted which absolutely untangle the narrative of such groups.
Which groups?
Well, I can give you some groups.
Yeah,
MEND, for example.
Yep.
I can give you other groups, like CAGE, for example.
Yep.
And
I just want to hear you.
And let's be honest, these groups attack us daily because of our view. We work with Jewish communities. And this is something that this House needs to understand, and also say to the Home Secretary and to the Home Office that there is a time where we have to stand up for core values. We talk about British values. Now's the time to stand up for them.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. And perhaps I can just turn then to one other area that I wanted to look at. Do we think perhaps that we are overblowing an issue that doesn't affect lots and lots of people up and down the country for a political agenda that you might be suggesting some are following? And the reason I ask that question is that in a poll against a control group on racial and ethnicity-based harassment, British Muslims said that 77% of them said that there was no problem, against 50% in a control group. So far more British Muslims said there was no problem with harassment, and indeed the same effect was found in religiously grounded harassment. And 79% of British Muslims said there was no problem, against 55% in the control group. So may I put it to you, that while there's always a possibility that there are quirks in polling samples, actually the discussion around harassment revolves around third-party stories rather than reality.
Do you want to pick that up? Or not?
Well, I'd want to know what the sample size on that poll is.
3,040.
And
So
do you know where
statistically
those?
valid.
Do you know where those people were recruited from?
Well, it's statistically valid, so it would have been a random sample across the country.
Exchange polls done by 20%.
But it's an ICM poll, so
Yeah.
it's statistically valid.
So it's in areas where there's a greater than 20% Muslim population. So it's a specific areas where they pick that up from.
You know, actually, one of the interesting things about that is if you are looking at people from areas of high Muslim populations, we don't see a high correlation of hate crimes to those areas. So there might be actually some kind of skewing from that poll that I think might merit some further research.
Well, it was interesting.
From what I can tell,
may I
yeah,
just
sure.
come back, just provide a point of information which might help you answer. When we had some experts on social media come in front of us, actually the retweeting and liking and replies and so on to tweets generated an awful lot more coverage than the original tweets themselves that highlighted "I've been abused." So it's very easy to ramp up, I would argue, the reality of harassment against what might be seen as a metric in terms of the number of tweets that you might find that include discriminatory or harassing commentary.
I think I see what you're trying to say in terms of it's easy for a story about an incident of harassment to get to ripple across a network online very quickly. And I agree with you that that's the case. But I think the implication that I'm hearing in your question, perhaps I'm wrong, is that this is not that much of a problem. I think that's totally incorrect, because I think if you go and you actually sit down and talk with people in Muslim communities, polls are one thing, but if you go and you talk to people who are members of Muslim communities, for them, this is a significant concern. It's a significant anxiety. I'm not saying it's number one. When a Muslim might go to the polls, that might not be the only thing that they're thinking about. They might be thinking about, what's my tax situation going to be when they're deciding on who to vote for. They might be deciding, are the schools in my area going to be supported, right? They have the same concerns as everybody else. But I would say that it's very, very surprising to see that such a high proportion of Muslims don't feel that Islamophobia is a problem. I've talked to many Muslims since I've been in the UK over 5 years, and I can tell you that Islamophobia is a concern for all of them.
Mr. Versio,
May
I just get an answer from Mr. Versio on this? And the reference, again, I make is that it was research done by Demos, and less than 1% of 99,000 tweets with the post-racism or safety pin hashtags actually represented unique instances of hate crime.
Yeah, look, we have to look at different things differently. When the Metropolitan Police are putting out figures that say that hate crime against Muslims has gone up by 70% in the last year, when TellMama have figures similarly talking about a massive spike in hate crime against Muslims, when we have just this weekend somebody going out saying, I want to kill a Muslim, and stabbing an individual, I think it's very important to put the context in place of actually a rise in Islamophobia to an extent that doesn't, that I think that poll does not represent in reality.
And I would just add that that DMOS study was based on an algorithm that scraped things up, right? So the stuff that we're looking at TellMama, for example, things that people have seen and reported to us. So that kind of, it tells a different story as well.
Thank you. Stuart MacDonald.
Thank you. It's interesting that so far, with the exception of the sort of Levison stuff, you haven't spent your time advocating for legislative changes. Would you say that is because you think there are sort of dangers and perhaps greater restrictions in what people can say, or is it because you think the issue here is using the powers that we do have already better?
I think it's very much an issue of using the powers that we have in a more effective way. One of the things that we've put out in our reports as well as in our submission to this committee was the fact that the current counter-extremism strategy and the current hate crime strategies are focused on forms of the far right and neo-Nazism that were applicable, I think, maybe even 5-6 years prior, or even longer than that. There's a significant need to quickly update the way that we analyze the far right and neo-Nazism today, and start understanding that extremism is not limited to Muslim communities. Actually, it's spreading throughout, and we're seeing an increasing polarization in the United Kingdom in terms of the public sphere. and we're seeing more and more of the support for the far right. We have counter-extremism powers that aren't designed to circumscribe speech, but actually to provide support for de-radicalizing people. So those powers are there, but they're being used disproportionately on Muslims at the moment. And I think that there's a lot of scope for people who don't support British values from other communities to be included in those de-radicalization programs.
Ms. Mbugu, would you support changes to hate speech laws?
The answer to that is no. There is a fine balance that we have between the right of free speech and European conventions. And I think that the balance is just about right. It is a question of implementation. That is the key here. And so I wouldn't suggest changes in law. What I would suggest is how we enact and put into practice those right the way through at the front desk level through our police forces. But I also want to add something here, which is that the CPS has been very, very positive, very progressive in the way that it wants to tackle issues. And its reading of the law and its ability to tackle some of these issues, I think, needs to be raised and commended, and we will commend them, because they've been extremely proactive. So no change in the law, but how we enact that, how do we put into practice, I think needs to be more robust.
Mr. Piercy?
I think as a whole, I agree that we need to have this very strong balance between free speech and hate. It's a very important part of our society that we're able to be open as to who we are. There is a slight area that there is protection of discrimination against some religious minorities, such as Sikhs and Jews, that doesn't extend to Muslims in the not a race according to the Race Relations Act in 1976. There are some people who are talking about the fact that there perhaps should be a review of the 2006 Racial and Religious Hatred Act, because that's what the Law Commission advised. Potentially, I think that that's something to think about, and you know, we shouldn't just rule that out entirely. But I agree that the vast majority of the concerns that the Muslim communities have are not to do with the legislation, but more about the implementation, because that's the real area that needs to be worked on. And Leveson and the implementation of Section 40 of the Crime and Courts Act 2013 is something that can and should be done.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you.
Tim Lawson.
This morning rather hijacked my line of questioning, but perhaps I could rephrase it in a rather more measured way. You've spoken quite a lot about the media reporting of insightful language, and you've spoken quite a lot about what politicians haven't said, perhaps to condemn some of that. But what rhetoric by mainstream politicians do you think there has been that could be held responsible for promoting Islamophobia and other forms of hate crime? Mr. Thursday, perhaps first some examples.
Yeah. I think that there were examples that I gave in the submission. For example, Nigel Farage said that Muslims want to form a fifth column and kill us. That there's never been a migrant group that wants to change who we are and what we are. I mean, that's the type of rhetoric that was given by Nigel Farage prior to the general election. The Conservative peer, Baroness Saida Warsi, said there is a simmering underbelly of Islamophobia within the Conservative Party. There are, around the EU referendum, we had the famous breaking point poster. So there are lots of examples.
By UKIP.
By UKIP.
So if we could just perhaps park UKIP on one side, because we all know where they're coming from. The more mainstream, although perhaps UKIP's become a mainstream party, and that quote from Baroness Warsi referred to an opinion of something was there without giving examples. I mean,
that's correct.
We were very keen in the anti-Semitism inquiry to get to the heart of examples from all the parties, and that's why the committee was particularly keen that all the parties were questioned in front of us as to what they were doing about specific examples of anti-Semitism. So it would be useful to have some specific examples of where policies, speeches, stunts by mainstream politicians, be it ministers, shadow ministers, backbenchers or whatever, have specifically made your job harder, particularly the TellMama, the sort of reports coming in that have been triggered and have given rise to people then going on saying, well, if he or she, an MP, is saying it, then that must make it acceptable to repeat these sorts of feelings or to take them to a new level.
Very happy to share some of those offline. I don't have any to hand, but I can write to the committee if that's helpful.
That will be helpful. Perhaps from TellMama, a few specific examples that you've had, Mr. Mogul, Mr. Ganesh.
Specific examples. I don't have many specific examples to hand. I think I'm just going to flip to the section that we do have some information on this one.
Let me add
Please.
in the meantime. I think we're very fortunate to have the politicians we have, and people out there might not like that, but I think we're very fortunate to have you here because, frankly, I'm glad I live in the United Kingdom, bearing in mind what's happening in Europe and in the United States. Let me start off by saying that. Let me also start off by saying that 5 years ago, 6 years ago, a Conservative government was not looking at these areas. Today, it is seriously looking at these areas, not only, obviously, in anti-Semitism, but in anti-Muslim hatred. We hear from some sections of Muslim communities that this government is at fault, this government has a problem. Well, I can't answer for this government for a lot of things. But in the area of hate crime, let me tell you, this government and this Prime Minister, who was previously the Home Secretary, has been firm, robust, and absolutely fair. And actually work on anti-Muslim hatred supported through the work we do. But we have found ministers open, receptive, willing to listen and willing to act, because they know one thing, and I'm going to say this pretty clearly, they know one thing, that if they don't tackle anti-Muslim hatred, they actually give succor to extremism and counter-extremism developing. And the fact is, we can walk into, thankfully, a minister's office and have the ability for a minister to listen to us and take it seriously. And I'm saying that because many Muslims out there in Muslim communities constantly say, the government are against us, the state is against us, the state, it doesn't want us to be Muslim and they don't want Islam. And I'm sorry, I've never heard such rubbish in all my life. Because today, I can tell you from the Home Office through to DCLG and the FCO, anti-Muslim hatred is an area that they are seriously looking at. And I am so glad that we live in the United Kingdom today as Muslims. And whilst we may have difficulties, let's not detract from what Miqdad has said and others have said. There are difficulties. We can and we will overcome these difficulties, and we must maintain that sense of hope.
Mr. Booker, I think we would all say here to that, and those are very strong and helpful words. And the reason for my question is in no way to make a party political point, but to draw a division between what politicians are actually saying and what they're represented as or misrepresented as saying. And I think a lot of the criticism we've had is rather more in the domain of the media, and you quoted some very good examples, Mr. Verzi, which are very often not based on what a mainstream politician has said, but they are misconstruing or building up something that may have been on social media or third hand, very often to do with the fringes of politics or just general morons, and all of a sudden it becomes a mainstream story, and supposedly government and politicians are in some way connected to it. So I think the distinction where there is a case to answer for the media and the social medias, we've had this on the anti-Semitism report and others, of more responsible reporting of what actually people do think. Can I quickly just come on to another, and if you can give some more examples, but really helpful, and I'm playing devil's advocate here to try and drill down to this. In terms yes, I'm going quickly on to the next
Can
thing.
I just, before you do, and I will come back to you, so just to follow up, in terms of having further examples, that would be immensely helpful. And also to recognise that there may be a difference between what government does and what political parties do in campaigns, where there is also can often be heightened language used during political campaigns. And it would be very helpful if you have further examples of that you want to challenge us with, because kind as it is of you to support politicians, we also, I think, in this committee want to know where there are challenges as well. Mr. Lawton.
Absolutely endorse that. Just to come back to in terms of what government does and has done, and if one looks specifically at something like the Prevent strategy, and the committee has been quite critical about the way the Prevent strategy has been presented and handled, do you think that the way the government, this government, has presented the Prevent strategy has, and the way it's framed counter-radicalisation, that has led to Islamophobia, or to people using that as a hook or an excuse, or on the media again, misrepresenting it in a way that can then cause these sorts of problems. And one criticism that certainly has been of Prevent, and I've been critical of it, is it very much concentrates on Muslims, and what about the far right, which doesn't get much of a look in there, but very clearly there is a serious problem with some of the maniacs on the far right. So could the government have done things differently, this government and government generally, in the way it presents policies like Prevent?
I think Prevent is a large topic. I mean, in terms of the concerns within Muslim communities, and I think this is quite widespread when it comes to Prevent in particular, and I think that feeds very much into what Fiaz was saying about Muslim communities feeling that the government's against them. I think the Prevent policy and the perceived or lack of work on Islamophobia is seen as a big reason why the government's against them. I think that's the feeder or the driver. I don't have direct evidence to support that, but that's my feeling and understanding. When it comes to Prevent in particular, the concerns are very widespread that Muslim communities are targeted, not just because of examples that have happened, but because of the way that sometimes it's presented. When certain politicians talk about Prevent and the focus on Muslims, when, for example, 10 times more people have been killed in Northern Ireland due to terrorism than in the rest of the UK in the last 10 years. I'm not saying that I don't want to diminish what's happening in the UK, not at all, but not treating all things equally is very important. When David Anderson, who's the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, says that it's extraordinary that the government is not talking to Muslim groups like the Muslim Council of Britain on issues like counter-extremism, it's just worth noting that that's what independent people are saying about this issue. And when we need to get that trust back, that's something that's very important. And adding to what Fayaz said, and perhaps a slightly different perspective here, the cross-party working group to tackle Islamophobia, which was set up by the government 2012, I think, that group, one of the individuals I think who's speaking later, Chris Allen, resigned from that group, as did Matthew Goodwin, because they felt the government was not giving it sufficient support to do the work. So there is something there that needs to be done. This needs to be taken seriously. So I think there is an area that does need to further work.
A lot of the work that we've done on the Prevent strategy suggests that it was developed in 2007, piloted in 2007, and had one sort of form of approach until about 2010. That was one that was very much community-oriented, in which various community groups were getting funding. What we've seen since then is more of a centralization of the strategy and much more control within kind of the criminal justice framework, as well as the Home Office. That has certain advantages, but also it's brought out, I think, a lot of disadvantages. And one of the big disadvantages is that in many places where the Muslim community could have had ownership over the delivery of Prevent, that actually hasn't happened. There hasn't been enough consultation with Muslim communities in the delivery of Prevent. I think that's been the biggest drawback. And I think that in terms of dealing with the far right more effectively, having that dialogue and doing a better job with it would actually address some of these concerns that we have with the far right. So I think that the way that the policy is actually structured and being delivered is actually leaving communities out, and that needs to change.
Okay, we have two other committee members want to ask questions, and I think that's why I want a quick, very brief follow-up question, but I'm conscious that we have obviously let this first panel run a long time because your evidence has been very helpful, but can I ask you if you could give short answers to us, even when we're asking you very long questions now, given the time that we have. I'm going to ask David Burrows, then James Berry, and then come back to Naz Shah.
Where the growing threat is to the Muslim community, I mean, is it from the far right, or would you say it's more broadly from racists, from those who just exhibit xenophobia?
I think it's a mixture. I mean, I think the stats will be able to come from TellMama on this, but my understanding or feeling is that there are people who are using what they see in the media, what they see elsewhere, and the idea of Trump or these other spike phenomena, to try and justify their actions. Yeah. And sometimes it's not people who have always been members of far-right groups, it's individuals who have just had bigoted views in general, who are latching on to a broader movement. But I think that maybe you can add...
The reason I say that, and just bring in TellMama, is that you seem to, in terms of definition terms, you look at the fact this is a broader suite in relation to racism and xenophobia rather than necessarily specifically Islamophobia, and whether there's a danger of trying to bespoke this issue when really we need to tackle the issues of racism and xenophobia at heart?
That's a really good issue. It's a really good point. And the answer is yes, we need to tackle the issues of wider racism, because the 1 in 10 figure I said when I started off at this committee basically start off at schools. So we need to actually do a lot of community education work that starts the process off of trying to counter some of the prejudice and the bigotry and the racism. So I think that's a lot of the work where it can actually counter some of the more extreme elements we find in society over time. But you asked where the risk is, and the risk today is of a lone wolf actor doing something against members of the Muslim communities, and we are seeing more of those people being more aggressive and actually being more targeted in their approach towards Islamic institutions like mosques. So people willingly on social media saying, I want to go to this local mosque and stand outside. That's the kind of, stand outside and throw a pig part into a mosque. It's that much more focused, aggressive stance which we are seeing, and that is of concern as well.
Okay, and just drawing on in terms of the example of outside mosques, you made the parallel relation to the Jewish community and the work and good relation you have. Do you think there's a case for particular funding and support that the CST gets? Do you think there's a parallel in relation to the Muslim community?
The answer to that is absolutely. One of the reasons we set up in TellMama was to absolutely parallel what the CST were doing. That's why the CST worked together to effectively support us when we started off our work. Over time, that ethos has been lost somewhere in the Home Office, and actually what has been produced has been a central fund which will fund any faith institution for security measures. But the fact of the matter is, the risks that we are seeing towards Islamic institutions means that there has to be a definitive, identical structure like the CST that actually looks at support for security for mosques and support for volunteers to stand outside mosques and to ask people, how are you, who are you, what are you doing? In the long term, we're not asking for the securitization of mosques. Let's be clear. We would like open and cohesive and open communities. What we are asking for is that the CST model has been absolutely brilliant for the Jewish communities, and actually there is a wide open gap for Muslim communities, and actually there's an existing body, and we have the best relationship we have with other faith communities with CST and Jewish communities, and it's an open goal if you ask me.
I would just like to add very briefly, the current funding pot that Fayez has mentioned, that's about 2.4 million, and it requires applicants to put up 20% of that funding on their own. Now, it's important to note that the Muslim community is clustered in areas of deprivation in the United Kingdom. So it's important to note that sometimes that funding or raising that kind of money might not be possible for many mosques. So that's something that I think should be considered in the policy.
Okay. James Berry.
Do you agree that a balance has to be struck between the press not feeding Islamophobia, as you outlined at the outset of the evidence, and the press shedding a light on issues that arise in minority communities that might otherwise go unchecked?
Yes. Fundamentally, I mean, of course there should be. I mean, I'm not aware of Muslim communities talking about the fact that newspapers shouldn't talk about real issues. If there's a fact on the ground that they're talking about, it's very important that that's talked about. I mean, that's part of what journalism is all about. But the problem is not that. The problem is the way that it is packaged, the way that it is sensationalized, the way that it is brought out much further. For example, the Dame Louise Casey had a report that came out. The way that was reported, instead of talking about it overall, picked out individual elements, and those individual elements sensationalized them and changed them, and then decided to say that's what the report said. Now that's a problem. If instead they just said here are problems within Muslim communities that need to be dealt with, and and this is the reality of what's going on, the concern would be very different. And just adding to that, it's about consistency. The report talks about a range of different communities. It talks about the fact that domestic violence is the majority of issues when it comes to domestic violence are within white British communities. That's not a front page story. So I'm not saying that we should necessarily say that journalists should not be free. Of course they should be free to do that, but to do so in a way that is consistent, that is fair, that is open, and that doesn't sensationalize stories and make up stuff that's not real.
Yeah, so I want to ask about I think the headline you quoted was sort of 70% of Muslims think that this is a majority Muslim country. I think I've looked at the Casey report just now, and I think that probably refers to part of her report where in one school the pupils thought 50 to 90% of this country was Asian, presumably because they lived in a majority Asian area.
Correct.
But that was something that featured in her report. So what was wrong? What was wrong with that specific? report?
I mean, if they decided to report that, I wouldn't have had a problem. The Mail on Sunday has retracted that article and had a correction saying it was basically saying it was incorrect. Okay. The Daily Mail has said the same as well. The Sun, I believe, is in the process of changing and might be changing their article on this. The Sun. The Daily Express hasn't come back to me yet, and the Times, I think, are currently under investigation with IPSO on this issue. So all 5 newspapers decided to misrepresent those stories and say something which was factually incorrect. If they'd said one school in a majority area has some weird views, I would be like, okay, that's reality, report that's fine. If they decide to make a massive story out of it and disproportionately target Muslim communities, that's just inaccurate, that's dangerous, and that has implications on what Muslims feel on the ground. There is a narrative that's being created where Muslims are criminals, Muslims are terrorists, Muslims are this. So when you have to deal with important issues, if they are somehow tagged onto this broader narrative, it's a problem. Just because, for example, a criminal does a criminal act, the fact that they happen to be Muslim is irrelevant to that case, but if that happens to be the front page story of a newspaper, that is problematic. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Okay, and just in relation to something that Mr. Mughal said, I think that most of us, or probably all of us here, do not like quite a lot of what we hear from a lot of Donald Trump's coterie. But the fact of the matter is that those individuals are now going to occupy senior White House positions, senior cabinet positions, will be world figures. And so it would be very difficult for the press not to report things they say, even if those things are Islamophobic, in the same way that the press has to report the bile we hear from the president of the Philippines or the dictator in North Korea. But how would you suggest the press should deal with comments that people in those senior positions make differently?
I would not dictate in any way, shape or form to the press. I think those are hard-won freedoms that we have had. What I will ask is that where there are commentators in newspapers, that newspapers seriously look at some of the views that commentators are promoting and ask themselves, does this actually sell papers for us in the long term in new markets? Is this what we are providing in terms of social good to our country? They need to ask them some real questions around some of the views that are coming from commentators, which I think are pretty toxic. But the last thing I want to say on that side, I wouldn't touch the press. I think the press need to have a free hand at what they're doing. The element I would ask, though, is that if you look at the websites in relation to press articles, we need to have some moderation on some of the views that are out there. You will get reams of anti-Muslim hatred. And actually, moderators need to do one or two things. Either moderate them or switch them off. And I think that there is a place today for that to happen. That's not affecting the right for the press to report. It's not affecting opinion. But what it does is stop those haters to come in and have the oxygen to air their views.
Yeah, well, that's very similar to social media issues, of which I think most of us, and certainly I, completely agree with every word of what you said earlier. Just one final question. Do you think there's a role for the Muslim community here in creating its own sort of counter-narrative? Like, I know the Ahmadiyya community often invite the press in and it has some very favourable stories in the Evening Standard. I know the Muslim Council of Great Britain, whenever there's a terrorist atrocity caused by, in the name of Islam, always puts out a statement saying this is not in the name of Islam and actually explaining why it's doctrinally against what's written in the Quran. Do you think that there's a bigger role for the Muslim community there?
I think, yes.
I think the Muslim communities can always do more. I think there's a long way to go in terms of trying to change that narrative on the local ground. Your friends, your neighbours, your schools, being participatory members of society as much as is possible. I think that to an extent has happened in many regards, but of course more can be done. But we have to recognise bad news sells, sensationalism sells, negative ideas about Muslims sell. We have a narrative out there that Muslims are bad. If you have a newspaper puts out a front page which is really, really negative and stokes hatred, and the next day they say, oh, sorry, that was wrong, and put a correction on page 2 in a small font. I think that we have to recognise where the balance of power lies. And here, many parts of the media speak to millions of people, and that's really the greatest source of concern for me in particular.
Okay. Okay, and final quick question from Nashar.
I've got just a couple of questions. Fiaz, you said earlier when we talked about the London mayoral campaign, but that must never happen again. Is that because it was Islamophobic?
The answer is yes. It was punching those buttons. It was punching those buttons.
Okay, thank you.
And actually, second of all, it caused division in our capital, and it can't happen again.
Thank you. Second thing, I wanted to bring you back on. Whilst you've complimented the Prime Minister's response to hate crimes, I've just looked at your because you had an incident around the Conservative Party, Tory Party, and that one you weren't as complimentary in terms of you actually on your blog. I did just have it up. Was that you said your staff had been stripped of a dignity, that your service users or clients or people who report Islamophobia and certainly LGBT issues. What was the response you've had from the Conservative Party around that?
Well, just to give you some context, this was when we tried to do a fringe at the last Conservative conference. Unfortunately, we were thrown out from our own fringe. We never got access to it. The response so we made a number of complaints, one of which one of our staff members said he was homophobically abused, and the director of TellMama, who's sitting there, was actually also felt intimidated. The response we got back did not answer the concerns around the LGBT issues, did not answer the concerns around what happened to the director of TellMama, and actually just rebutted us to say that the Conservative Party hopes that in future you register early. That was their response to us. So I don't think...
That's not the first time, is it, though?
In relation to other groups, I think there is a history of other Muslim groups trying to get in. I don't know the context of that, but I just want to say this. We tackle hatred, that's the nature of our work. But actually, I think there is an issue where if we turn up and we can't even get access to our fringe because, frankly, we are treated in such an undignified manner, then I think sections of the Conservative Party itself need to seriously look at what they are doing with individuals like ourselves when their own government sponsors and supports us.
Okay, my final question. I'm just going to read something from that blog of yours, and referring back to Mr. Jayawardne's question, particularly to you, Miqdad, around the victim mentality. So in your statement, TellMama have said, our work is difficult enough as it is, challenging some groups within Muslim communities who sell a view of Muslims as perpetual victims. We have to constantly challenge that destructive view. There are others beyond Muslim communities who believe that Muslims should not be seen nor heard. There are also those who believe that anti-Muslim hatred does not exist and that Muslims bring it upon themselves. In the middle of these toxic views, we try and undertake our work, and under a barrage of abuse, threats and intimidation over the last 5 years, from both from groups selling the perpetual victim narrative and those on the extreme far right. Which brings me to the question, Miqdad, first yourself. The poll that Mr. Jayawardne referred to, the policy exchange, the most recent one, and I know we've had conversations about it, but can you just explain how dangerous that is, or what is your view on that?
Well, firstly, the polling itself, done by a reputable agency. It's worth noting the Policy Exchange, who did this poll, BBC Newsnight accused them of fabricating evidence in the past. So let's just keep that in mind when we talk about any poll done by an agency. Let's understand the context. The real danger is when an individual poll is misrepresented either by a right-wing think tank who refuses to show where its donors come from, or whether it's from broader society. It's problematic. For example, that poll says that 50% of Muslims, only 50% of Muslims report to the police. The question was, if it was someone who was close to you and they happen to be worried about them and they might be going into talking to terrorists, for example, what would you do? And like the rest of the population, 20% said, oh, you know what, we'll talk to them first, or we'll talk to family. And then 50% said that they would talk to the police. That figure was actually higher. In other words, more Muslims would report to the police than broader society because of the way the question was asked, and therefore the way that you represent it is very dangerous. If you have a simple question, would you report it to the police? 95% of Muslims said they would. So the problem is the way that things are reported is a major part of the problem.
So is there a victim mentality? Would you agree or not disagree?
Yes, there is a section, sadly, I'm a Muslim myself and I've been doing this work for 20 years. There is a section which is absolutely being fermented and structured over a period of time where the view is that the government, the West, other communities are against Muslim communities, and that victim narrative is being cycled. And once you create that mindset, you create an individual who starts to disentangle themselves from wider society. And if we just look at the bottom line, they actually will earn less, they will have less future options in their life, they will have future less experiences, and actually it's deeply destructive to the individual.
So you've just trying to pick that, because on one hand you're saying there's an increase in hate crime for Muslims, massive increase, and yet there's this victim mentality. So is it the victim mentality that's increasing the hate crimes, or they're both?
There is definitely an increase in hate crimes and hate incidences because we see it when it tallies with international incidences. There's a clear tally within the civil society activity of some groups within Muslim communities. When I say victim mentality, I'm not talking about victim mentality around hate crimes.
I'm talking about hate crimes.
Okay, there is. If we look at the hate crime element, there is some degree to the cycling of view as well, that the overwhelming issue affecting Muslim communities is anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia. That's the difference. The reality is there is an issue, it is impacting on Muslims' lives, but it is not the overwhelming issue which then takes women away from doing their shopping, takes them away from going away from externally or leaving the home. That's the bit which I find, when exacerbated, starts to impact on the mentality of individuals and reduce their ability to be mobile in their own lives.
Okay, we need to move on to our second panel. Can I thank you? Before you go, I just asked, so further information that's been raised that would be useful from you would include some of the cases that you referred to, the way you had problems with Twitter or with other social media, including the example that you referred to with the far-right networks, but any others would be very helpful. We will be taking evidence from social media companies in the new year. Secondly, any more information that you had in terms of how schools have responded to some of the issues around young people that we touched on at the beginning. Thirdly, any information on inter-Muslim hatred and how that is being dealt with. And fourthly, any more information about trigger events, which we did cover briefly, and what recent trigger events have been. That would be immensely helpful. Can I thank you for your evidence and for your time, and we will move on to our second panel. Thank you very much.